This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 2 of my second book, Multis and Monos. What the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. This is chapter 2, part 10 on Japan. 21st on the future. 21st century globalization. I suspect strongly that most of contemporary Japanese culture will not survive 21st century globalization. Actually, this may not be such a strong statement, although at first glance it sounds very insulting to the Japanese, because most of the culture of any country will probably not survive 21st century globalization. The planet is now only a few years away from a new kind of warfare, namely the war of ideas. I believe that global television, that is, stationary orbit, cross-linked inter-satellite digital TV, which will allow any country to uplink a TV signal, have it cross-linked to several other TV satellites directly, and then multiply downlinked to the full surface of the Earth, so that people anywhere on the Earth can capture TV signals from the sky on their wristwatch TV receivers from anywhere else on the Earth, will prove to be the greatest social and political revolution on a planetary scale in the past 100 years. Wristwatch TV receivers will be mass-produced and become dirt cheap, and everyone on the planet will own one. To be deprived of one will mean being excluded from world culture. Pressures will then rise for everyone to speak English, because most of the programs sent up will be in English. As a higher proportion of people speak English, the higher the probability that programs sent up will be in English, thus setting off a snowball effect. With English as the world language, it already is, but just less widespread. Ideas between people who were previously intellectually and culturally isolated can begin to spread easily. A war of ideas will then begin, and only the most popular ideas will survive. This means a mass planetary culture-cide will take place. Thousands of cultures will be wiped out. In fact, this process has been going on for a century or more, but on a smaller scale, where a nation-state absorbs the small primitive cultures into its own. What I'm talking about is French culture, German culture, American culture, etc., all being absorbed and mostly destroyed into one huge global culture which will combine the best ideas of the planet. As soon as anyone anywhere has a good idea, it can be spread at the speed of light to everywhere. People will be educated from global, not national media. This will make people think globally, not nationally. This is starting to happen now with CNN and BBC World, but these two TV channels still have strong national biases. Fresh young inquiring minds will be exposed to ideas which compete with those of their own traditional local national cultures. Most of these traditional ideas will perish, because the young people of all countries will choose to reject them if they see that these ideas are inferior to others. This rejection will generate tremendous social tensions and powerful generation gaps as the young adapt to the world culture and the aged remain in their old familiar national cultures. Of course, some of these older national cultural ideas will survive and even be taken up as the global norm, but only the best. For example, how will Americans react when they finally learn of the level of contempt that Europeans have for their religiosity, their nationalism, their middle-browed media, their gun laws, their 200-year-old presidential constitutional system, which elects popular idiots belonging to the opposite party of the elected majority, and thus creating political deadlock, etc. How will the British react to discover that the French sneer at British Puritanism, which unfortunately the Americans inherited? How will the French react when they see the Americans laughing at the arrogant inferiority of the French? How will the Germans and the Swedes react when they learn that few other people like their emotional coldness? How will the $300 income a year Chinese peasant in the poorer western provinces react at seeing Japan's material western provinces react at in the poorer Western provinces react at seeing Japan's material living standard, now over $40,000 a year, which together with Switzerland and Luxembourg is the world's richest, with the US at $28,000. This was in 2007, maybe? Actually, or maybe 97, maybe 20 years ago. Actually, I prefer to be able to read the PPP, purchasing power parity statistics, rather than these exchange rate-based comparisons, which are rather misleading. How will millions of intelligent third world students living under dictatorships react when they can read democratic literature easily on the world's telecommunications media? How will little countries react to being swamped by the new ideas and developments all coming from elsewhere? Planetary culture will be one huge washing machine, churning up everyone, revolutionizing everyone's mind. The big, brilliant, intellectually creative, influential countries like America, Britain, Germany, France, etc. will obviously make contributions to world culture. Probably the most any one country will make will be about 10%, and possibly 20% in the exceptional case of America. Still the most creative and dynamic country on the planet. The US has won 175 Science Nobel Prizes from 1901 to 1995. Yes, I read this in 97, I think. Britain, with a quarter of the US population, 66. Germany, 61. France, 25. It will be interesting to see if the 21st century global culture will be dominated by the Anglo-Saxons, as in the 20th century, or will it be led mainly by the Chinese and the Indians, each with a population of over 1 billion. At living now, I don't see the Indians having much impact, for the obvious reason that their average IQ is only 85. So Indians are as dumb as American blacks, also 85, whereas the Chinese have an average IQ of 105, 20 IQ points more. So I see that. So if Asia is going to dominate, it will be because of the Chinese, not because of the Indians. The Indians are just too dumb. The question now is, how much of today's Japanese culture will survive? A second important and distinct question is, how big a contribution will Japan make to world culture? As Japan's young people start getting world TV, the web, cheap 3D holophones, etc., and learn to speak English well, what will happen to today's Japanese cultural values? In my opinion, I see most of Japan's traditional values dying, except the valuable ones, such as gambare, which may be copied by other peoples, the attention to detail, which generates high-quality products, Japan's sense of beauty, Japan's stress on the importance of education, if intelligently done, Japanese arts, etc. I would guess that Japan will contribute about 5% of world cultural input. This might sound small, but consider the mathematics of the number. There are about 200 countries, so if each country contributes equally, that is about 0.5% each, so Japan's figure is 10 times higher than the average, a major contribution. But so much of today's typical Japanese mentality, the lack of creativity, the group pressures, the masochism, the insularity, the intercultural incompetence, the education system, the lack of democracy, the dictatorship of the bureaucracy, the powerlessness of women, the enslavement of men, the emotional poverty, etc., will probably all be swept away. As evidence of this, I only have to look at Japan's young generation, who are rebelling against traditional Japanese values. They want a greater degree of personal freedom and look mainly to the US as a model, although not uncritically. The US also has many problems, which hopefully will be swept away as well. Once Japan becomes linguistically competent, that is, can speak fluent English, it can lose its insularity. I see an explosion of intellectual creativity becoming possible amongst the Japanese. Interestingly, in the 19th century, the Americans had a reputation amongst the Europeans of being copycats. The US caught up with Europe economically around the turn of the 20th century, but then took another 50 years to become truly creative, and to lead the world. Now that Japan has caught up with the US economically, how long will it take Japan to become creative? Without creativity, Japan cannot be number one in the 21st century. The traditional emphasis on wa and its inhibition of criticism can be swept away by creating a stronger form of Japanese popular democracy. With Japanese rulers under popular democratic control, Japan's financial resources can then shift away from company investment towards social infrastructure, getting rid of the third world housing by building upward with modern earthquake-resistant technologies and doubling the number of square meters per person. With Western levels of living space, the old pressure behind the need for wa will no longer exist. Japanese can then feel as free to criticize each other, a prerequisite for a democratic and thriving intellectual and scientific life in the country, and to express their personal opinions, their hone, as Westerners have always done. I suspect that the Japanese will keep their diligence and discipline, which are desirable qualities, so that when combined with the new creativity and personal freedoms, Japan would really make a mark in the world. To do so, I strongly suggest that Japan embark on a policy of aiming to overtake the US as number one in as many fields as possible. I believe Japan has the potential to do it as long as its savings and investment rates don't drop to Western levels, a real possibility if Japan becomes a true democracy. Japan should then, in my view, deliberately create the world's best research labs, bringing in the best people in the world in large numbers, paying them top salaries that no one else can compete with, supplying wonderful equipment, combining the best features of the Japanese labs with the best features of the Western labs, making these labs very gaijin friendly by giving the gaijins a large degree of control over the day-to-day running of the labs. Once enough top people come, creative synergy will be generated and new technologies will inevitably come from them, since they will have the world's best brains. Japan can then become the top scientific nation and contribute to world culture mightily. If a similar process is undertaken in non-scientific domains, then perhaps Japan could dominate these fields as well. But a lot would need to change, because at the present time, with its poor creative record, Japan has been described by Japanese authors as being a brainless economic giant, or a cultural black hole, copying everything and giving nothing back. With lots of the world's most brilliant foreigners in Japan, Japanese output of scientific and artistic ideas ought to increase. However, I believe that in the 21st century, social life will be increasingly dominated by technological influences, especially by cosmism. So if Japan wants to be number one, leadership in science is critical. Japan, if it makes the effort, if it deliberately plans with a vision to become number one scientifically, it could also become number one in general. It's just a question of investment and bringing enough top people to Japan to generate large-scale scientific and intellectual synergy. The rest should follow. Japan cannot do it alone because its population is only 2% of the world's population. The major challenge for Japan will be to attract and to keep, far more difficult, the world's most talented minds. Major efforts will be needed to reform Japan's level of social development. Hopefully this essay may help a bit in that direction. At the moment, Japan is so insular and so socially backward by Western standards that few Westerns want to live in Japan for more than a few years, as the statistics show. Japan is still very much, as I put it, out of touch and out of date. Postscript on Japan. This postscript was written 10 years after the above section on Japan. At the time of writing, I have not lived in Japan for 7 years. So I guess I wrote this in 2007. Having left the country just after the turn of the millennium. So why did I leave? There were several reasons. The immediate one was that the research division I was working in got axed. The NTT funders of the lab felt that they did not get enough profit from the research, so the blue sky type projects were axed. Only the shorter term research goal projects were given a second 7-year contract. I could have tried to get another job in Japan, but by that time, after having lived 8 years in that benighted country, I had pretty much done a complete U-turn on my attitudes towards the place. I had not bothered to learn the language because I felt there was no payoff in terms of intellectual discussion and stimulus from the Japanese. As I wrote above, I found the Japanese to be intellectually sterile. Another major reason was that my original reason for going to Japan in the first place, that is that Japan would become the richest nation and then attract the world's top brains to come to Japan, went up in smoke after it became clear that Japan was incapable of solving its decade-long deflation problem, what the Japanese call the lost decade. In the bubble economy of the 1980s, many Japanese invested heavily in land speculation, so that when the bubble burst, the banks were left with huge unpaid debts. The Japanese were unable year after year to solve this problem, which reflected very poorly on them as a nation. The Americans quickly started ignoring them and turned their attention in Asia to China. My sense of pride in Japan slowly and steadily dwindled away. The statistics showed that the Gaijins were brain draining back to where they came from, as they too, like me, came to the same basic conclusion, that is that Japan is an unfit culture for Westerners, too socially backward, too closed, too racist, too groupist, too intellectually sterile to be considered worthy for Westerners to live in. There was another main reason too, and that is the deeply held racist attitudes of the Japanese. Basically, they do not want foreigners living long-term in Japan, disturbing their Japanese wa, complaining about the many inferiorities of Japanese culture, called Japan bashing. In practice, it's very difficult to get a permanent job in Japan. In the lab I was at, the contracts were always short-term, never tenured. The message the Gaijins got was, "We Japanese don't want you here long-term. We want your knowledge, but not you. Sayonara." So with the Gaijins not wanting to stay, and the Japanese not wanting them to stay, the result was inevitable. By the end of the decade, nearly all the Gaijins had left, and Japan was left with the reputation of being foreigner unfriendly, unfit for Westerners. Just to check, I hit the website recently of my old lab to see what proportion of the researchers are still foreigners, compared to the 30% I was used to in the 1990s. It was much lower. They had virtually all gone. This is sad for Japan, because Japan will now be forced to abandon any hope it had of becoming number one. Japan is too small and too uncreative to be able to dominate the planet intellectually without the support of the best foreign brains in the world. Japan's almost stagnant economic growth of the 1990s meant that by the end of the decade, its salaries were no longer competitive. The US had had a wonderfully successful decade economically, profiting from the hefty increase in productivity due to internet commerce, the cell phone, etc. So American salary levels pulled the Western researchers back from Japan to the US. Japan helped in this process by repelling them from Japan with Japanese social inferiorities. Even if Japan can get back into a healthy and sustained economic growth mode, it's unlikely the Gaijins would want to return to Japan. The reputation it built up in the 1990s is just too negative to be easily dissipated. It will take decades for Japan to modernize socially, to make it sufficiently fit for Westerners to live in. The interesting question now is whether China will go the same way as Japan. I am the first full-time full professor from the US with a Caucasian face in my Chinese university, which ranks in the top 10 in the country. That is a Chinese Ivy League university. So Westerners like me are starting to judge China. Is it a culture fit for Westerners to live in? Is China capable of attracting and, more importantly and more challengingly, keeping its talented foreigners? Is it possible that a decade from now I'll be writing a report similar to what I've written about Japan, with a pen equally sharp and cutting? Only time will tell. At the time of writing, I've only been living a year in China, so it's too soon to really say anything that is more than superficial. Ad-libbing now, I have now lived 11 years in China. I will definitely leave in about a year or so. The place is a political shithole, a pygmy nation. I am very, very negative on China and the Chinese. It's definitely, it's not even a democracy, for Christ's sake. 90% of people who live outside China live in democracies, and China is not one of them. It has over 1,000 Lao Gai, that's slave labor camps, concentration camps for political prisoners. There are 3 to 5 million people who are political prisoners in today's China. The man on China's money, Mao Zedong, killed about 80 million of his own citizens, 45 million in the Great Famine he caused, 58 to 62. He put about 50 million people through the Lao Gai, 27 million of them did not return. So that's up to 70 million now. Another 10 million or so from the Cultural Revolution he created, and the anti-rightist campaign, stamping out professors who hated the communist regime. So all in all, makes him the greatest tyrant in history, and yet his face is on the money. So China's a political shithole, a pygmy nation. Okay, back to the book. If China can sustain its incredible economic growth rate, then the standard of living in the rich southeast coastal cities will surpass that of the US in a decade or less in PPP, purchasing power parity terms. I'm probably a decade ahead of the crowd, that is, the crowd of Western researchers and professors attracted to work in China by Chinese salaries, etc. So my views on China that I may be writing in 5 years may influence thousands of Western researchers and professors who will by then be considering living and working in China. In 5 years I should be fluent in the language and absorbing China's weaknesses and strengths into my personality. Japan failed to become number one in the 1990s. Will China succeed in the 2010s? Where Japan failed at living? Yes, of course. I mean, this country's not even a democracy. Utterly unfit for Westerners to live in. Okay, that's the end of a long section on Japan. G, US, United States. Pro. Dominant. There are few people alive in the world at the time of writing who would disagree with the idea that the world's dominant country at the present time is the US. It is the most influential and most prestigious country in the world. It wins most of the Nobel Prizes. It has given the world the internet and modern economics. It crushed fascism in Europe and Japan in the 1940s. Its popular culture, in the form of movies, TV shows, pop songs, and blue jeans, have spread worldwide. Its high standard of living has attracted millions of migrants who want to be part of the American dream. That is, having one's own house, a car, a good job, education for the kids, overseas trips, and all the mod cons. America publishes more books per year than any other country and attracts and keeps the best brains in the world. Its prestige is so high that young people in many countries put fractured English words on their t-shirts just to participate vicariously in that prestige. The largest economy in the world is American. At living now, that's no longer the case. In purchasing power terms, it's now China. That's not surprising. Chinese population is more than 4 times larger than Americans, and it's growing so much faster. Back to the book. It makes the largest number of cars in the world, and that's not true either, now China. It has the most highways, the most satellites, the most warheads, and has the biggest military budget in the world. I could go on and on. In short, it's a nation of firsts. It is number one. Open. One of America's great strengths is its openness to the world, so different from Japan. America's high standard of living and its willingness to allow talented foreigners to come to live there is one of its greatest strengths. At the end of World War II, America was absolutely economically dominant. It was producing about 80% of total world economic product. That is, 80% of all world economic goods and services came out of the US. Europe was devastated, having committed continental suicide and destroyed its economies. Hitler gave the US a wonderful gift in the form of the European continent's Jewish genii, such as Einstein, von Neumann, etc. Thus America got the bomb and the computer. European migrant talent in the 1930s and 1940s raised American intellectual standards and creativity. By the 1950s, America began to be the most creative culture on the planet because so many of the world's best brains had chosen to live there, to have a decent job there with its high salaries.